It is a perfect case study in bad safety culture. Welcome to Undocked.
Welcome to Undocked. I'm Raal Harris.
And I'm Nick Chubb.
And we are now unplanned, unscripted, and definitely undocked. So
last week I did a really lovely menu of the show at the top, and then we didn't talk about any of that stuff. I figure this week we should just jump in and see what happens.
I think so. We'll go where we need to go, and see where we end up. But I think let's start off with Happy Day of the Seafarer. It's Day of the Seafarer.
Happy Day of the Seafarer.
By the time this goes out, it won't be, obviously, but it is today. So we're kind of celebrating for all those seafarers out there and thinking of you on this day in the year where, I mean, of course, in our professions, we should be thinking about them every single day. And I'm sure there's probably not a day go by when we don't have a conversation in some regard about, certainly in my line, around the people behind the success of shipping. But yeah, this is their special day, and obviously a big theme this year with the bullying and harassment theme of seafarers. And it always kicks off interesting debates and reflections and stuff like that. I've got maybe two things to talk about as far as that. Maybe we start with some, just last week we kind of finished talking around big deals in shipping. And we'll start here because it's a bit of a scoop again. Day of the Seafarer. Last night, I think I picked it up. And that was the shipping giant NYK's acquisition of Kadmos, the very cool Berlin startup in the fintech world, Seafarer payment system. And I don't think when I just laid that one on you, Nick, I don't think you'd seen that one yet, but you're familiar with Kadmos.
Yeah, you've scooped me. No, I hadn't seen it. Yeah, no, I'm very familiar with Kadmos. We do track crew payments and payroll as a kind of market, so we've got a pretty good idea of kind of who's in that space. And the interesting thing about NYK particularly acquiring Kadmos is obviously they run Marco Pay, or they launched Marco Pay, I think, back in 2019. And that is probably the most established kind of competing platform. But I think Kadmos, from my sense, from a kind of outsider's perspective, having had a bit of a look at both products, I think what Kadmos have done well is that they've got a very, very good eye for good consumer product design, and I think that's probably something that's missing within Marco Pay. So I think it'd be really interesting to see what if they go down the route of integrating these into a single product, what will come out of it. I think you'll end up with a really good product for seafarers at the end of it, which is great.
Yeah, it's into space. My one of my understandings, had some brief discussions with Marco Pay quite a while back now, was I think they maybe concentrated maybe on the Filipino seafarer market, and this is perhaps more of a kind of an international play now. I don't know, but I think it definitely goes into that consolidation with purpose kind of correct category of, rather than sort of portfolio building. This is quite clearly a very strategic acquisition to say, as you say, to kind of really strengthen in that space. And it'll be interesting. I was kind of texting, trying to get some inside track last night with a couple of people and some friends there. It all seems very positive. So good luck to them. I hope it goes well. So yeah, so on from there. Nick, you also said you've got some sort of focus, something you've noticed around Seafarer, Day of the Seafarer to bring up. Do you want to take us there?
Yeah, I struggle, to be totally honest. I struggle a little bit with Day of the Seafarer these days. I feel like I've become slightly jaded as time goes by about Day of the Seafarer, and I think it's a very important initiative, and I think it's very important that the work of seafarers is recognised, but I also think sometimes it can become almost a bit of a kind of flurry of empty platitudes from organisations that could do significantly more. And I think a lot of the issue I take with it as well is, I think bullying and harassment is a really important topic and absolutely should be discussed, and you should find the right kind of platforms to deal with those kind of issues. It feels like a very easy topic to pick for Day of the Seafarer because it kind of pushes the discussion away from the IMO and from regulation and perhaps some of the burden that a lot of seafarers face, and onto something that's very easy for people to kind of get behind and sort of galvanize around, I guess. I read, it was a couple of days ago, there was a viral LinkedIn post by a guy called Alexandros Lignos, which I won't read the whole thing, but I thought it really summed up the way I think a lot of people feel about this this issue and this day in particular. I'll just read you a couple of extracts from it. There is a growing hypocrisy in our industry that no one wants to talk about. Behind every new regulation, every polished IMO resolution, and every digitalized checklist, there is a silent truth. The people drafting these rules have never felt the weight of the sea. And then he goes into quite an in-depth, quite powerful kind of narrative of what it can be like being on a ship in a storm. And I'll just read you the kind of last bit of it. It says, that kind of storm can bring you to insanity. How many have been on that bridge with zero visibility, knowing they still need to fill out 3 logbooks and prep for reports they control the next morning? Few, if any, and yet regulations keep coming non-stop. New requirements, new codes, new training modules, always additions, never subtractions. I thought that was just it's a very long post. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. It's well worth reading. But I thought that was such a wonderful critique of the IMO, is that I think there is a real issue that we're just constantly focused on addition when it comes to regulation, and the ultimate burden is carried by those who are on board. It seems slightly mad to me that we're in a situation where you need to understand the ins and outs of satellite systems, as well as know Morse code and understand the full alphabet of signal flags. And I feel like something's got to give. And that's just one example, but something's got to give. Like, we can't just keep adding and adding and adding. And I think the focus of Day of the Seafarer, while laudable and admirable, as I say, I think it's just very easy to pick a topic like they have that shines a light out into the industry, rather than kind of shining a light back into the IMO to say, what are the things that the IMO could be doing to make the lives of seafarers easier day to day?
Yeah, I mean, lots to unpack in there, but yes, I think everything that you're saying is something that chimes with sort of fairly, with a lot of the conversations that I have around this, particularly with, when speaking to seafarers, but also with people who are working on the front line with them and sort of understand that kind of pressure and listening to what they have to say. I think I'm also privileged to be in discussion with some of the people that are formulating revisions to STCW and so on. And I know that is, organizations like Intertanko and Intermanager and Nautical Institute. In conversations with them, I think everyone is very, very mindful of that, that to put anything new in, you've got to be thinking about what you can remove and take out. And it's kind of interesting. We're seeing it a lot in the decarbonisation space, where it's like kind of like, that's the last frontier. Well, this is kind of how it's got to work. And then these are the risks that remain. And then this is how we mitigate them with training or with procedure. And that's kind of, like the last bit that then sort of obviously has to then fall onto those that are working at sea. And it is an ongoing issue, I think, and difficult to strike a balance. I think everybody would agree that seafarers are overburdened with regulation, but at the same time, if you look at areas that are unregulated, and then there are additional concerns then around whether there is sufficient standards in place to be able to kind of make sure people are protected at work. And so it's a kind of a difficult balance, I think, to strike, isn't it? I think one of the things, it's one of the things I'm at liberty to say as an individual, rather than any of the organizations that I might represent, is like the obvious thing to do would be to sort of create more space and time for that kind of thing on board by having more seafarers on board. But of course, then this is a commercial industry, and that would then have big effects on the profitability and the sustainability in many regards as well of whether the viability, I guess I'm saying, of businesses, and looking at some of those margins. So it's a difficult discussion to be had. But I think it's interesting that you raise that report from the front line, as it were. And I think I'll certainly have a read of that and take it on board. And I think I've noticed the same thing, coming into this morning, looking to see if there are any kind of last minute things that we'd need to include in today's discussion. And there were a number of posts, I think, that expressing a certain amount of cynicism and highlighting specific issues. Another one I saw this morning was criminalization. And I don't want to get into the specifics of that because I didn't have time to research it properly, but a couple of posts there, very sort of heartrending posts around seafarers who've found themselves locked up. And that is an issue that, again, I think a lot of the organizations I mentioned are focused on. I know that Intermanager, which I'm vice president of, is very, very focused on that as an issue and looking at how we can start to kind of, support those seafarers who find themselves in that position. So, but I think, again, I had my own cynics post to bring up with you as well. Something I saw actually through Splash, as you know, Splash 24/7. We both, you work with them closely, and as do I. This was the post that seafaring is still the world's most dangerous profession. So this was the
Right.
Lloyd's Register Foundation World Risk poll. Around 25%, I think it is. Let me just have a quick look here. 25% of ocean workers report having experienced harm from their work in the past 2 years, compared to 18% of other workers. And this is the highest level recorded among any sector polled. You can look it up on the chart and put that in the link as well, where you can see it there against, construction and all these other kind of dangerous professions. And, clearly that's something for us all to reflect on Day of the Seafarer, as you said. Bullying and harassment is not to be trivialized, but also actual kind of danger and harm to seafarers, physical harm, still an issue that's there. And I think that my question to you, obviously we're supposed to, this is a maritime transformation discussion that we normally try and have here. And this is something that is not transforming, is staying the same, right? And I think my question to you was, I started thinking, well, look, we talk regularly about all of the different, technology solutions coming into the sector. We look at those, and those typically, as you will well know, start with a problem to solve. So they come in and they take a problem to solve that the industry has, and that's where they make their fortune fundamentally. My question is, how many of them are focused on this problem? And what does that potentially say about it? So I'll await your response, but I've done a few little calculations of my own, but I'll await your response.
So I couldn't tell you a number, although we do actually track it, because we do track kind of solutions in the crewing space. So it'd be interesting to go away and look that up. But I will tell you that anecdotally, I know that those who have tried to solve these problems and work in this space have really, really struggled commercially. It's very, very, very difficult to grow a kind of convincing commercial business with a solution that is aimed at topics like seafarer welfare. And you can kind of read from that what you like, but and I think there's partly, if it's not compliance driven, it's very difficult to sell or very difficult to kind of make a business case for. And so partly there is a kind of compliance question or aspect to that. And then partly, I think, just getting a real understanding of what some of those problems are, the root of what some of those problems are, so that you're not just window dressing something, I think is really, really difficult. And it takes a lot of trust between the solution provider and the seafarer, and also between the seafarer and their employer, whether that's a ship management company or a ship owner, to be able to have those conversations and to really get to the root of where the issues are. And I think making that work is it's not a technology problem, but it's a difficult one to overcome.
Yeah, it's kind of what I expected you to say. I did some sort of very rudimentary kind of look through, and with the aid of, we always talk about AI, with a bit of cheating with AI. Sort of the figures it came back with, to be estimated to me, there was 1,000 estimated startups, roughly 500 to 600 classified under maritime logistics, port tech, vessel automation. 100 to 200 around sustainability, emissions reduction, digital twins, that kind of thing. And then 50 to 100 on crew safety, well-being or training. And when I looked further into that, of course, all the big names you'd expect to be in there, Ocean Technologies Group, Siebel, Mintra came up as people working in the sort of, but it was all in the maritime training space, or potentially some sort of adjacent crewing solutions. Nobody really looking at that sort of harm reduction or that as a technology problem. And I think what you kind of highlighted there are the barriers, really. The barriers that I think are acceptable, or the ones that don't make me kind of uncomfortable, are the ones where we're talking about, difficult to prove causality, not an obvious technology solution to the problem, that kind of thing. Something where you mentioned as well the amount of trust, the amount of information that a company would need to be able to disclose to vendors, to perhaps to kind of, or we could say, put it another way, perhaps a lack of kind of accessible data on which to base, any kind of technology hypothesis. The bit that makes me uncomfortable is the idea that there's not a profit in it, that there isn't, that if you could solve that profit, that if you could solve that problem, that there wouldn't be profit in it. And yeah, that's a kind of sobering thought. I guess another thing, though, looking at that and looking at that space, do you think there's an opportunity in there if somebody could get together a sort of a coalition of the willing, of people who were prepared to say, well, look, this is an unacceptable statistic. This is a solvable problem. Technology has a role to play in it, and we will back it, and we will give you the data, and we will support it. Do you think that there's an opportunity in there, certainly from a differentiation point of view?
To sound like a real pessimistic cynic, but I to be really honest, I struggle to see a large opportunity in that space. If I'm just being totally honest with you, I think taking any kind of, so coming back to that point around trust, we've been involved with projects over the years where companies have tried to, for example, bring wearables in to track fatigue. First off, just putting it into a low trust environment. If your employer turns around and says, we're going to start tracking your kind of vital signs through a wearable, I can see an immediate, that's like sort of big brother is watching type of question. But actually the project we were involved with, it wasn't a low trust environment. It was a very reputable ship ownership manager, and the crew were very much on board. But then going through all of the compliance hurdles, because you're effectively taking very, very personal data and making it available in the workplace to your managers on board, that all of a sudden opened up a whole host of kind of ethical and legal questions that, being totally blunt, no one was ready for that was involved in that project. And then those were overcome through a kind of high level of will among everyone involved. We ended up getting to the point where there was a kind of dashboard available to show fatigue of various watchkeeping team members. But we then kind of came to the so what question. What option does a master have who has maybe 2, maybe 3 watchkeeping officers underneath them to be able to relieve any kind of fatigue? It's not like you can just rustle up an extra officer of the watch to make the shifts work better, because you're kind of caught within the wider confines of the industry, that we've moved in this direction of reducing manning, adding additional regulatory burden, and then not necessarily investing in the technology that would help and alleviate that for the crew side. So without trying to make it totally pessimistic, I do think there are areas where that might seem slightly counterintuitive, where you could probably have quite a big impact quite quickly for a relatively low investment. And so there may be opportunities for technology suppliers to come into the market to cover those things. But some of the really fundamental questions like fatigue and crew welfare, crew well-being, I think they're really, really difficult markets to crack, and difficult for any employer. If you move the whole thing ashore, usually employee assistance programs and things like that ashore. But actually, if you look at kind of the usage stats on those, they're usually incredibly low, because again, it just comes back to people's habits and people's willingness to engage in a program that has been put on by an employer, rather than something that has come kind of organically from your own community or your own peer group. And so, yeah, I feel like that's very, very pessimistic, but I think it's also quite an honest view on it.
Yeah, and we talked last week, didn't we, about like in the context of AI, and we talked about how there was sort of an intrinsic need for humans to be in the loop and to be part of it, because they bring something different to it. And I think what comes to the fore when you look at this kind of last frontier, if you like, around sort of, around real sort of safety culture, and whether there's a technology element to that. There are clearly, a big part of that is about culture and behavior, which are inherently kind of human things. And I think like the one that always springs to mind here is like where it's sort of enclosed space entry, continues to be this kind of big killer in our industry. I did a lot of work on that, and we looked at putting in, of course, there was a lot of training that we developed on that. I developed a kind of a very early computer game option around that, which was designed to kind of try and address this behavioral element. But also we looked at kind of implementing some software as well to manage and to do things in the enclosed spaces. But the strange thing about that enclosed space death thing is it seems to be, a lot of it seems to come from an actual instinct. I'm talking about the fact that when people go into one of these spaces and go down, it's then the person that discovers them that then goes in. And I think the record is like 5 people or something that one after the other have gone in, and it's to do with this idea that that your just instinct is there to just help that comrade. It's a hazard that you cannot see, and of course training is one aspect to recognize that, but how do you kind of deal with that human thing? And this was the I mentioned the computer game. This is what I tried to do with the computer game. And the whole thing was like this setup. So you had various things. And it was like, when I say it's a computer game, it was like a kind of a, a first person. So you're looking through your eyes, you wake up in your cabin, you go through a number of sort of morning routine type things. You have the morning meeting and you see your colleagues there, and the two of you are sent down into a pipe tunnel to fix a problem in there. So, and then I kind of gave them this little job that had to do with a valve. So there's this whole kind of thing they had to do to, turn it this way and then turn it that way. You're doing it with a mouse, And the whole thing was to try and kind of get them to sort of forget that they were in this enclosed space, forget that they might be being judged around that, concentrate on the job. So that then they would go like, you're on the walkie-talkie and you then hear your friend, and then you see him further down the tunnel through the next kind of opening. And the whole setup, the whole thing was down to sort of to try and see if people would actually think, or they would just go in there. And it was really interesting because we got, we tested it on various seafarers and on, cadets and things like that, and people would kind of get quite angry that they kind of fall foul of this little trap. But the one that really got them was that there was one of the options that you had in the game was to put on the escape device, the EBD, put that on, and then go in and save him. And of course, what you're supposed to do is put that on, get out, and call the rescue team.
Yeah.
And that's what really got people annoyed. They were like, "But I have 15 minutes of air, I could have." That was the kind of point, really, to sort of start those conversations. So I think that, when you talk about technology in the maritime space, I still think there's a lot of legs to go with that kind of, that kind of simulation, that kind of working with behaviors, scenario playing, that kind of thing. There are some people who've moved into that space. The reality is, though, and it comes down to it, is to get that bang for your buck, to get that just very small, potentially make that small point and get people to exercise that kind of mental muscle there. It's very expensive. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, to do it. And that brings it back to the question there about the profitability of this kind of approach and solutions. And I think the other thing is it still remains anything to do with behaviors. The causality is hard to connect to, and consequently ROI is very difficult to prove.
I think you hit the nail on the head though when you talked about culture, because I think there are so many examples. Actually, a great example, I watched over the weekend the new documentary on Netflix about the Titan submersible disaster, and it is a perfect case study in bad safety culture and what bad safety culture looks like. And so if you're at all involved in safety, any safety critical aspects, any safety critical work, it's well worth watching.
This was a private operation, right? A sort of, shall we say, a leisure trip. Give us a bit more background on it, because I remember it in the news. Horrific incident.
Yeah, well, it became, when it happened, it sort of became global news for the course of about a week. But to give you the kind of the very short version, a kind of visionary swashbuckling entrepreneur type decided that he wanted to create a submersible that would, quote unquote, kind of democratize access to the deepest parts of the ocean. And alongside that, he was pretty obsessed with the Titanic, and so developed this submersible that could go down to the Titanic. And instead of using the kind of traditional materials, which is titanium for the hull of a vessel like that, he decided to develop it with carbon fiber, which to a certain extent worked, but it was always kind of bound to fail. And everyone in the submersible community had told him in no uncertain terms that it was going to fail. And in fact, various points along the journey over the course of kind of developing the sub, testing the sub, getting to the point where it became operational, members of the kind of senior maritime team, the senior engineering team, near enough every senior director raised issues and then was asked to leave the organization after raising those issues. And so there was just no way that this guy was going to stop pursuing this idea. And they actually, you kind of said it was a leisure operation. Kind of, I guess, potentially a slightly sneaky thing about this was that they never took a paying passenger. Because as soon as you start taking paying passengers, you do actually have to go down the route of getting the vessel classed and registered with a flag. And there are a whole host of new regulations that came in. So they had these mission specialists who, by coincidence, had paid an enormous sum separately and then were invited to come on as members of the crew. And this is despite the fact that none of them had any real expertise in this space. They were just wealthy individuals. One of the there was a father and son on the sub at the time that it imploded. The son was 21 years old, I think. None of them had any real maritime experience. They were not trained as submariners, let alone as mariners. And so there's a whole host of stuff that can be unpacked around that, which I think is really interesting. But I would say my kind of biggest takeaway was that if you end up in a situation where you've got an individual who is kind of hell-bent on making something happen, that is not willing to listen to the advice of experts and will kind of plow on ahead anyway, it really can only end one way. And it did end in the most tragic of circumstances. The sub imploded with 6 people on board. For a long time, I think something like a week, there was a quite intense rescue mission because they just lost comms with the sub. They didn't realize that it had imploded at the time. So they spent a long time trying to find and recover the people. And eventually they discovered the wreckage on the seafloor, not far from the Titanic. And obviously, there are lots of technical reasons why the sub failed. But far more interesting to me was that they built lots of safety systems that should have detected, well, not should have, they did detect whether the sub was going to fail or not. And you could literally, on the documentary, they plot on a chart of this kind of early warning system that could pick up on the fibers breaking under the pressure. And they touted it as a really advanced safety system. And it worked. It worked really, really well. Problem was, it was completely ignored. And I think that just kind of comes back to the fact that if you can throw all the technology in the world at something, but if you don't have the kind of culture in your organization that is willing to put a stop to an operation because you don't feel that something is safe, then you're never going to solve the problem. And so I think there's lots of things that technology could do to change this, but so much could be achieved through going after some of the more quote unquote kind of fluffy stuff and actually making sure that you've got a really strong safety culture. And that's not an easy thing to do. It's very, very difficult. But I think that the payback of it is huge.
Yeah, I feel quite strongly about this, having sort of, worked with various sort of bits of technology around both seafaring and shore office. I think for me, it's about making sure that the technology can take care of a lot of that irritating manual things that add very little value to create the space for what you described so eloquently as the fluffy stuff, the stuff, the people stuff. But that is the point, very often it's easy to look at things, particularly when you read through incident reports and you kind of think like, what were they thinking? What was going through these people's mind that they didn't kind of do that? And of course, you've got to walk in another person's shoes. And if you can see the kind of the pressures that they're under, time, fatigue, all those kind of things, they undermine our decision-making, which is why I think the human factors approach championed by Ockham and that is really good, because you're looking not just at human element, they kind of interchangeable, aren't they, as topics. But I think human element is a bit more about people and the decisions they make, whereas human factors kind of seems to me to take in more of a kind of appreciation of the things that might be a barrier to a human being making a good decision, of doing the right thing, from it be they procedural or ergonomic or whatever. I think that I'm also kind of thinking about our earlier discussion just now about there being too much regulation and putting too much regulatory pressure, and then kind of talk about this incident which was circumvented any kind of regulation and perhaps they're a barrier, so this is the thing to remember. I think some of this stuff might be sort of tedious or might be kind of feel like an unnecessary burden, but it's there for a reason. And that's a good example. And I think that's a really fascinating thing as well, that it wasn't the system didn't fail, the person failed to take notice of that. And I think that's that's something that it sort of gives you mixed feelings, doesn't it? It's sort of, on the one hand, it's like there's some confidence that these systems do work, and then the fear that actually that just leaves us reliant on people to listen and to obey them. Interesting.
What else have you got? I've got one more I can do.
Well, what's your one?
Well, I think particularly as it's Day of the Seafarer and And we're constantly talking about the fact that the maritime industry is quite bad at publicizing itself and bad at kind of telling a story to the wider world and to the public about the importance of maritime and the importance of shipping. I just thought it'd be good to raise so that I'm not completely pessimistic and miserable on this episode. Good to raise, I thought, a case study of that done really, really well. It was a couple of weeks ago now, but did you see about MSC's Yellow Festival?
No, I missed it.
So
thank God you were here.
They basically took over the heart of Hamburg. So they took 3 of their ships into the center of Hamburg with a full MSC livery of a full container load of just MSC branded containers. They used it as a kind of launching ceremony for one of their ships. They had a drone show. They had live music on a kind of floating stage in the middle of the river, and they managed to attract 100,000 people to come down.
Wow.
To the river in Hamburg and actually come and see these ships and understand a bit more about what the maritime industry does for Hamburg as a city, but then also for the wider population generally. And I just thought it was like a genuine masterclass in public engagement. And obviously, Hamburg as a city, it's much easier than places like London or Southampton, where because you've the
it's a port city, isn't it?
Yeah, the terminal runs kind of right through the city, so you can't really be in the city and not spot the ships. But even with that, the effort that MSC had gone to ensure that the public really understood what they did and really kind of get the public on side, I just thought was absolutely fantastic. So I'll post a link to it in the show notes. But I think you could take that model and replicate it in other port cities around the world if there was enough kind of will to do it. And I think it would make a big difference to the number of people who just get exposed to the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's it's fascinating. I'll certainly look at that with interest. And I think we talked about before, haven't we? The sort of the kind of the terminals thing, container shipping, did a real kind of, was a really great initiative to kind of, in terms of world trade and smoothing world trade. But a lot of those ports moving out of cities, it's no longer being seen to arrive, from ship in the heart of communities and stuff, as kind of distanced people from the reality and understanding of how these goods that they appreciate get to where they are. So I think that's really a really great initiative, and it'd be interesting to see. It'd be interesting to think about how many ports that's actually kind of feasible to, thinking about it, something to consider. I guess Singapore is potentially somewhere that could really come to life as well, because I think Singapore just is fascinating. Every time you kind of come into land in Singapore, you just seeing all those ships in the bay, anchorage is just incredible. It really kind of brings
leaves you in no doubt
as well. So that's
as to what that city's focus is.
It's another one of those cities that really brings maritime to life, I think, as well. Running out of time, but a couple of things are just sort of and finally stories, if you remember That's Life, or something like that, or the news. And finally, I was amused. I mentioned, and we've gone through another episode. I haven't had time to unpack it properly. But we talked last week about the Ship Concept 2035 Splash. And it's been sort of like, I really want to do a deep dive in this, really want to do a read through of it. And I wanted to talk about it this week. And guess what? Life got in the way and I couldn't really read through it. And then I saw something Sam Chambers posted. And he said, we've used AI to turn it into a podcast. And I'd heard of this. This ability to do this, that you could do it. Someone mentioned it earlier this year. I think it was David Petrayko of Nautical Institute brought it to my attention. But this is the first time I've actually sat down and listened to one. And we'll put the link in, associate the link with it. But it's really funny. It's really fascinating the way it does this sort of simulacrum of a genuinely well-researched kind of, conversational podcast. In my head, when I was told about it, I sort of imagined it would be sort of very robotic and very kind of like, almost like, an AI narration of, let's turn it into a kind of pre-seed document and then do it. But it does actually create this kind of conversational, it's more professional than you and I, for example. But you know what I mean? It's like, check it out, because it's really amusing. And then it kind of, but Sam put a couple of things together this week. I don't think there's going to be a week where we don't talk about AI, by the way. But there's a couple of things on AI there where he's talking about, like, they actually used it to generate an article, and he's kind of like reflecting on the journalist's role, and what actually happens to content creators in this kind of space. So it's an interesting thing to keep an eye on. But if we've got the last couple of minutes, because I just want to bring us home with another little story about, well, 3 things about AI. Another one was we talk about energy transition, and you then put something up. I think it was you, Thetis article, yeah, talking about the emissions generating power of this technology.
Yeah.
I don't know if you just want to kind of explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the kind of obvious point that people possibly don't think about generally is that AI is very, very power hungry, and it takes a huge amount of processing power to make one of these, even a very, very simple ChatGPT or Copilot answer work. But if you start to then ask anything that it requires a little bit more thinking about, and might take a human a few seconds to think about before they answer. So what's the capital of France? Very straightforward. The answer is Paris. It can respond very easily. But if you ask something deep and philosophical, like can machines replicate human consciousness, things start to get a little bit heavy. So complex queries in large language models generate up to 50 times more CO2 than simple ones. There's one popular model that emits the same CO2 answering 600,000 questions as a round-trip flight from London to New York City. Another model that works in a slightly different way can answer 1.9 million questions with the same emissions. And so actually, when you start to think about your organization's carbon footprint, and we focus on energy transition for the ships and how to make that work, if you're using ChatGPT or Copilot or Claude in your kind of day-to-day work to support you in doing that, you may unintentionally be emitting a whole load more emissions that you weren't even thinking about.
Yeah. And this goes to the heart of that problem that we have, right? We're trying to decarbonize. We're trying to sort of say, right, we're going to replace the energy that we're using with non-carbon sources, renewable sources, whatever. But our consumption is going up and up and up and up. So we're not trying to just replace what we have. We're actually got to be thinking about the power demands of the future. And I was trying to explain that to someone who was questioning the nuclear option. Not to say for a second that I'm, advocating for nuclear, but I think that we have to be honest about, like, there are no good options when it comes to power generation, and we are continually inventing new ways to consume more and more of it, AI being but one example. But if we have time, there is something else I spotted from outside of Maritime again. And we had one of those last week, but I think it's kind of relevant, and it's on this very, very relevant to us, anybody thinking about how we approach this. Now, last week's podcast, we talked a lot about AI governance. And one of the examples I gave within that was around WhatsApp. And WhatsApp as an example, company email is tracked. They have access to it. If you leave with your WhatsApp channel, it's encrypted. It's the governance is simply not there to the same degree. And I saw this article straight after we did the podcast last time, and I put it in my pocket because I thought it was a very amusing story. And what this is WhatsApp have introduced this AI functionality, sort of chat functionality in there to sort of users. And this was a story where a chap had used this facility to try and get a Rail inquiries number. And it turned out that he was actually given some fella's number, some guy's mobile number. And so the quote, this was a story I spotted in The Guardian, and I'm just to quote it from now. The Meta chief, Mark Zuckerberg, called it the most intelligent AI assistant that you can freely use. But Barry Smellhurst, 41, a record shop worker trying to travel by rail to Saddleworth to Manchester Piccadilly, did not agree. It goes on. It was the beginning of a bizarre exchange of the kind more and more people are having with AI systems, in which chatbots try to negotiate their way out of trouble, deflect attention from their mistakes, and contradict themselves, all in an attempt to continue to appear useful. So basically, this guy, rumbled like, hang on, that's just someone's mobile number. And rather than kind of, sort of just go, oh, I must have made a mistake, it kind of led to this sort of AI chatbot sort of trying to go, let's focus on trying to solve your problem. No, I didn't scrape that number from a database. It's just a sort of random string of numbers, and it's just like kind of like, oh my God, this is the future that we're heading towards. It's like one of kind of like, we all hate these people in life who don't admit to their sort of mistakes and just continue to cause mayhem. And now we've sort of created a whole bunch of agents, that are just kind of programmed to do the same thing. It's kind of, it struck me as amusing and potentially highly dangerous.
I recently bought a cake, and when it arrived, it had kind of been smashed up in the post, and so it was completely unusable. So I contacted the customer services of the cake company on WhatsApp, and they originally refused to do a refund. I was like, I'm not having this. So then I got up ChatGPT, I went ChatGPT 4.0, and I said, you are a ruthless barrister, and your job is to like deconstruct their arguments about why they're not going to give me a refund and then write out an argument for why they should. And so I then got a very lengthy response back from ChatGPT, which I then put into WhatsApp and sent back to this customer service agent. And then within about 30 seconds, I had a very, very lengthy response back that was almost exactly the same, but counter-arguing all of my points. And then I realized that we're both sat here using ChatGPT. We've got two GPTs just arguing against each other about this customer services thing, and there's no humans need to be involved. In the end, I won and I got my refund. So my AI was better than theirs.
So yeah, but the cake never arrived, and this is the crucial thing. I imagine it was for. I imagine you needed the cake for some reason.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So who won really? I think you lost. You just got your money back. Yeah, okay. Make your own cake. That's the thing. Don't rely on, be self-reliant. But there was also just finally as well, something that I picked up on this, and this was, maybe I'm going to get to it because I don't think we'll have time to get into it, but there is some research emerging around the sort of mental capacity, mental fitness associated with this. And the more you kind of use these kind of things, the less you're exercising your own muscle.
Yeah, I saw that.
And when you are then unable to access these things, you're basically a vegetable.
It's basically making us less intelligent. We are all slowly getting stupider because we rely on these tools too much.
Well, it's something to think about. But maybe for another show, another next time.
Indeed.
I think. So with that, I guess we should wrap things up. Please keep the ideas coming. We're appreciating your comments but give us ideas, and we're also assembling our list. We did promise we'd invite some other people to join our conversation. So we're getting that list together. Let us know who you want to hear from as well.
Agreed. And if you are enjoying this, keep engaging with it. Stick a comment on Spotify or anything like that, or send a review. We've had a few reviews in, which helps the visibility of it and makes us think this is worthwhile doing, but also stokes our egos as well, which is very important.
Most important, yeah. Cheers, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, Raal. Good to see you.
We're also I'm racking my brains. I still don't have a sign off. It's episode 3. I still don't have a sign off. I've kind of been through, Chris Avasano's got the best one, Stay Salty. People suggested that to me. I said he's already got that. So if you've got any ideas on that, please help me out because
put it in the comments. Put it in the comments on Spotify.
I got nothing.
And we'll read the best ones out and we'll pick the best one. Bye.